Hello.
Hi, Arike.
Hi, Zena. Well, I think we are live. So I just want to say welcome everyone who's attending this session. I am Arike Oke. I'm the Managing Director of Black Cultural Archives. Mustn't forget to introduce myself. I'm very excited to share a conversation with Zena Tuitt this afternoon. Oh, hi, Juanita, in the chat section. So what this session is going to be is a full and frank conversation about mainly Zena's career journey. She's what the young people call a slashy. She is producer, director, creative lead, marketing manager, systems analyst. Like, she's everything that you might ever want. And I am delighted to know her and delighted that she's been one of the key supporters of Black Cultural Archives. She is a boss, as it says in the chat. So we are going to be chatting about careers, career journeys, the choices you have to make, the compromises you might have to make. But first of all, as I can see that our session's filling with people, I will tell you a little bit more about Zena. So Zena is the founder of GAFA, or GAFA Limited, which is a boutique consultancy company, and she's also the co-founder of Niche on Demand, which is a studio set up to executive produce content that tells authentic stories about Black lives. She has worked with creatives over the last 20 years. In addition, she spent 14 years at Ernst & Young in business development and management consulting roles, working in the UK, US, and across the Caribbean region. Prior to EY, she graduated in media studies at the University of Sussex and started her career at The Voice newspaper, followed by roles at Channel 5, Channel 4, and the Edinburgh International TV Festival, later working in marketing and theatrical sales roles at Universal Video, Warner Brothers, Buena Vista. She is passionate about media, developing talent and telling stories, and has executive produced independent plays and films. She's also a trustee of Theatre 503 and is on the board of technology startups. So this is pretty incredible as a CV, as a little abstract of your CV. So Zena, I wanted to start off by asking for your reflections on your journey, actually.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me to this conversation, Arike. The feeling is mutual, so it's great to speak to another boss. I guess there's four key things I think about when I think about my journey. The first one is relationships and how important those have been in terms of developing and nurturing relationships organically over my career, which have created pathways for me, whether through friendships or mentorships. Mistakes in terms of being able to be in spaces with people who have allowed me to make mistakes, and mistakes I have made independently that have given me insight in terms of how I might want to do things differently. And then I think purpose in terms of really having realized later on that I've always had some type of overarching purpose that has kind of driven me forward and helped me to make decisions at crossroads. And then I guess the last piece is around luck. That, you know, a lot of the things I've done, I've been in the right place at the right time, and I've been able to make an opportunity from certain things as well by being able to connect the dots. So I think that there's a song by Leon Bridges, which I've been listening to a lot recently, called Bad News. And the chorus is, I made a good thing out of bad news. So even when it's been a mistake or a challenge, been able to find the possibilities and opportunities in that. So
I think that's wonderful. And I think last time I spoke to you, Zena, I said something like, everything you say is so incredibly layered and there's so much in it. I feel like you took us on an entire journey just in that like 2 minutes, which is actually really beautiful. And you touched on so.
Well, you know, I grew up with hip hop, so I'm always want to drop a verse or go into some type of flow. So I guess that's where it must come from.
I think it's really cool though, because it's like telling stories feels so important to your career journey. And that's part of it. Like, it comes through you. It comes through everything that you say, and everything that you do is telling stories. So I think that's that. Sorry, I keep getting distracted by Juanita's little. Can you see the chat, Zena?
Yeah, I am trying to ignore
it. I'm enjoying it. And I do feel like the first session this afternoon was an incredibly important session where it took leaders of some of our national institutions that are funded directly by the government. And they were talking about, what BLM means to their practice and also to their institutions' practices. And our conversation is a really interesting counterpoint to that, because we're speaking from a very different perspective. And I'm really interested in what you said about making something good out of something bad, and the way that you look. What's your kind of viewpoint? What's your kind of like worldview that you have applied to your career journey? Because you've had so many twists and changes, and I'm just wondering, like, how many of those were kind of a conscious choice, and how many of those were you having to flex in and out of situations that no longer matched what you felt comfortable with?
Yeah, I think it's always been a mixture. I think I had, when I started out and I studied media at A-level, I always knew that I had a passion for telling stories and a passion for the power of media. And one of the things that was very aware, I had an awareness of at a young age, was my identity and my Blackness. And so pairing those two together in terms of my identity, my Blackness, the richness of my story, and not seeing that represented in the media, meant that actually I could see there was a place for me based on my passion and what my purpose became, which was to tell stories from my perspective and my friends' perspectives that I wasn't seeing. So one of the first documentaries or short films I made was at sixth form, which was called Do They Mean Us? And it was about how young Black people were represented in the media. That has stayed with me in some shape or form, even if I've known it or not. So when I got into the media, I recognized that in rooms I was the only one a lot of the times. And there was also language that was used that I felt uncomfortable with, which didn't reflect me. And so I got a point where the level of discomfort was too big to stay. So I think that's what's happened a lot along my journey, in terms of I've made compromises, but got to a place where the level of discomfort in terms of my values and my purpose was too great to stay. As you know, I always could, for me, I have a passion for working and finding purpose in everything I do. So I could always see how I could acquire a skill in a different context that would help me to get back on track at another point. So for me, it's never really been about job titles. It's been about the lessons that I can learn from the activity and the skills that are going to support me to be able to realize my ultimate goal. And I know everybody doesn't necessarily have a clear picture in that way, but that's just kind of how my mind works. So I was thinking at that point, I ultimately want to be a producer in some shape or form. So I'm going to do that in my spare time, or I'm going to do things in the context of my current role that's going to give me the skills that are helpful later on. So even at Ernst & Young, when I was working in projects, I remember one of the partners, when we were doing a large conference, whispered to somebody else, I overheard, he said, "This is a bit like a theatre production." And for me, that kind of made me smile inside, because I was like, well, yeah, that's basically what I'm using these skills to train myself for future. So my boss doesn't need to know that that's what I'm homing my skills for here, but it's getting great results here, but it's also giving me skills in a space that I'm not able necessarily to access at the moment in time.
So again, so much advice for people who are starting out in their arts and heritage, creative, cultural industry journeys, just in that one answer. And really talking about, I think in that answer, you're kind of talking about seeing each role as an opportunity to learn, I guess. I think, right? You're like, you know what you're kind of attracted to, and what skills you're attracted to and what areas of culture you're attracted to and what you're trying to get out of your work, that the part of you that you give to others is your work, right?
Yeah.
And so it sounds like you've really taken each opportunity as whatever that opportunity is, not only to do that opportunity, but also to learn and put those building blocks in place for your next step. So how far ahead have you thought about next steps?
But there was a period in my life,
general, not now, but like in general, your career journey.
I think I used to read a lot of sort of self-development books and books around I spent a lot of time doing change management. So books around change and transition and the psychology of that. And books by people like Stephen Covey in terms of books for highly effective people and starting with the end in mind. So I got into the habit of doing things like 5-year plans and journaling quite earlier on. And so I always sort of started out with a vision of how I would want my life to be and then work towards that. So as the saying goes, shoot for the stars and reach the moon or something. There's a phrase that's similar to it, but essentially
in the gutter and look at the stars.
I don't know. I don't know what it is right now, but the principle is that it takes a lot for me to be embarrassed. So I'm happy to shoot for an unrealistic goal and get to somewhere which is close to that, rather than feel embarrassed to share my desires and achievements because people may think they're unrealistic or I'm being, fantastical about it. So what I think about myself is far more important than what others think about me. And I think one of the lessons that racism had taught me is the fact that it's so important to care what you think about yourself more than others, because you're going to be in context. I learned from an early age where people are constantly telling you that you're not good enough or underestimating your abilities. And so you really have to hone that kind of self-confidence and self-awareness and self-identity, and also understand racism, which was one of the key components, I think, for my success, in the sense of the fact that nobody could tell me it doesn't exist. Nobody could tell me that there aren't things institutionally or systemically that are creating barriers for my success. And so having that confidence to know that's the reality, then, I just found ways to sort of navigate around it as much as I could. And that was through the relationships, being happy to make mistakes, being very clear on my purpose, and going on a personal journey of self-discovery, which nobody could own or put metrics on in terms of you're doing well because you now have this title or this level of achievement or success.
So I want to delve a bit deeper into that as well, because as you know, as I know, it's really tough. It's really, really tough to keep up self-belief, to keep just plugging away at it, to just keep going when you have doors closed in your face and you're like, okay, so that pathway didn't lead to anything. Let me try a different pathway. So I wanted to explore the role of mentors with you, because I know that mentorship is something that you find important to give to people, but also that's been beneficial for you.
It's critical. I mean, if nobody's putting ladders down, there's nowhere for you to go, because the biggest barrier to your success is access and exposure a lot of the time. So if you have no access and you have no exposure, then it's very difficult to understand what the opportunities are and actually get the experience to move forward. So at an early age, again, in my sixth form, I had a mentor who was a producer, one of the very few Black producers at the BBC. And so I had the opportunity, and at that stage I was toying with being an architect or being a producer. And I was paired up a scheme by Howard Jeffreys at North London College. He created this mentor scheme, which was transformational for me. And meeting that mentor was transformational in terms of me getting exposed to media opportunities, getting work experience at the BBC, working on shows like Wogan, The Late Show.
You worked on Wogan?
I did.
Anyway, sorry, carry on.
I worked with Terry. Yeah, that was a highlight. And then also being able to have the confidence to know how to navigate those spaces and how to speak to people in those spaces. So she enabled me to have experiences that I wouldn't necessarily have been able to have, stereotypically single parent, growing up in Stoke Newington, Hackney, that pathway would have not necessarily been open to me if I didn't have a mentor.
I do think that, so as much as each of us can be regarded as trailblazers because we're constantly going to be pushing things forward and forward, I think it's so important to be able to look at the generation, the working generation, right? Like, which is a different thing to, a familial generation. For the generation that's there before you, and to make sure you use them and their experience, and hopefully they will also be able to protect you from anything that they had to countenance, that they had to go through. So I want to just a bit more on mentors. Like, how do you get the most out of a mentor relationship? Like, how do you wring that relationship out?
I guess I looked at it, and I was lucky in terms of my mentor was very committed to getting, I guess, results in a way in terms of providing access. But what I learned from having relationships with future mentors, was being very clear in terms of what my personal objectives were, and doing some research on that mentor to really understand how that mentor could help me and how I could help that mentor in terms of, was there insights from my perspective that I could bring that they wouldn't necessarily have access to. And so it becomes a positively symbiotic relationship. I still have a very strong, I don't call her my mentor now. She's my friend, like one of my best friends. This is 20 plus years later, who the relationship we built from mentor-mentee, and the way that I valued those opportunities and showed up in the places that she introduced me and gave me access to make her proud, enabled that relationship to evolve into what we now have as a friendship. So I think it's just being clear in terms of what you want to achieve. You're not going there to be fixed, you're going there to be enabled.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When we've spoken in the past, I've been really, really struck by something that you said: people before jobs, that people become just as important as the roles that you have. So, do you want to go into that a little bit?
Sure. It's people that, make the world go round, really. It's people work in buildings. Buildings don't do anything. Job titles don't do anything. They're static things. The movement and the emotion comes from people. So what is critical, or has been critical for me, is those relationships, those emotional relationships that I've built, those stories and experiences that we've created. That means that 10 years, 15 years later, if I'm bumping into someone down the road, we have this shared experience that we can connect on. And, it becomes an organic process of us exploring, what else can we do together? So I think that it's important to have the basic skills, but it's critical to have the soft skills in terms of knowing how to build relationships and sustain relationships.
Absolutely. And thinking about relationship building and people, how important do you think representation has been, like visibly seeing Black women or Black men or other Black people in the spaces in which you've been moving your career?
It's been really helpful. Starting my career essentially after my work experience, my first key role was at the Voice newspaper. And so walking into an office which is basically predominantly Black was quite unusual. And so when I talk about luck being one of the key things, it was very lucky that was one of my first experiences. So, I'm sitting in the office, people like Gamble and Huff, who are legendary producers, are walking into The Voice. You've got Richard Addition, you've got Val McCalla, you've got Brenda Manus, you've got Winston Cornish, you've got all of these people who are the pillars of, Black media today and have supported the careers of many going forward. I could roll off like hundreds of names of people that walk through The Voice, like celebrities and
like
people.
Michael Williams, BCA's building manager.
Exactly, Michael Williams, who was like a legendary photographer.
Yeah.
So when
he never talks about his photography. It's so strange.
Legendary photographer. I mean, he's photographed some of the greats. I mean, and his work is phenomenal. So like these legends are just amongst our midst. So growing up around people who were just doing that, and then 20 years later, just seeing these giants walking among us, just gives you a sense of the fact that there are possibilities for you to do anything. And again, the sadness of that is, if it wasn't for inequality, these people would be revered in a very, very different way. I saw an article, I think it's in The Guardian, about Charlie Phillips saying, why has it taken so long for him to get recognition? I mean, it's crazy. But that doesn't take away from these magical experiences. So I guess answering your question, it's really important to have representation of people for you to know what's possible.
Mm. And in terms of like what you do around telling Black stories, I think that combines, right? So you, having found in your career journey, being around other Black people at The Voice, and then going into places like Channel 4 and the BBC, and then probably not really seeing that many other Black people or seeing that many Black stories told. So you're going from like The Voice, where it is the stories of Black people, spaces where it is not. And how has that kind of power, like, do you think that shaped your motivation about what the direction it is that you're ultimately going in now?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I go back, 20, 30 years, 30 years now, it definitely has shaped my narrative. Now I can think about it in hindsight. I think also going into spaces like working at Ernst & Young and in other corporate clients as well. And my normal is to have like diverse groups of people around me. Like I grew up, my mum sent me to an organization called the Woodcraft Folk, which was all about...
Oh, did you do that? Okay.
Yeah.
Adorable.
Woodcraft Folk, yeah. I think just being in that environment as my normal, it was really strange to come in environments where they would say things like, there aren't any Black people that can operate at a certain level, or we don't know where they are, we don't know how to find them. So all of that was very kind of strange to me. So I felt compelled to do stuff about it. And so, for example, at Ernst & Young, I relaunched the Black Network there. And it was easy for me to do that in the sense of understanding the steps that needed to be taken, even if it was emotionally challenging to sort of make it happen. But yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm excited about, we have a bit of a scoop that I wanted you to share with us today, and it relates to telling back stories. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I can't remember.
About a certain thing transferring to the West End.
Oh, yes.
You're being like incredibly humble, which is something that we do. And you don't need to be that humble.
No, seriously, it must be age and not drinking the cod liver oil recently. I just couldn't remember.
So tell us the scoop before I forget to bring it up.
So when I decided to go back into the creative industry, I was approached by a young playwright, emerging playwright, extremely talented playwright with a script. And I read it, loved it. And I gave some money to support it to be staged at Theatre 503. And the play was called Juve, and the playwright was called Yasmin Joseph. And that play, consequently, has gone on to be picked up by Sonia Friedman Productions, who's known to be the most powerful woman in theatre, and is taking that play to the West End to be at Harold Pinter Theatre. And it's also going to be a Virgin adaptation, is going to be on BBC Arts. So Rebecca Muriel Ree, who was the original director, is also directing the play with some other of the team that were involved in that as well. And we did one of the fundraising events, money for Theatre 503, for the play at Theatre 503 at the BCA. So
so it was a
all
scoop
comes
for
back
us.
to the Black
It's like
Culture
a double
Archive.
scoop. It's a double scoop for BCA. The first one was when the reading of the play happened at Windrush Square, which is our venue. And now this one where you are revealing to the world that one of the ways that theatre is coming out of lockdown is with Juvet, which is a play that you produced. And there's some love in the chat. Executive produced, of course. You got and I appreciate that you picked me up on that, because we've got to always recognise our collaborators and understand that arts is a collaborative practice. So there's some love for Juvet in the chat. And I also want to encourage it says there's like 46 people watching, so I want all 46 of you to leave us some questions in the chat, because we only have about 12 minutes left, and so we also do want to address things that you people watching want us to address. So before I go on with all the things that I'm interested in, which is a lot of things, Nikki says, can you, Zena, talk about how you've called out racism and or misogyny in the organizations you've worked for, if you have called it out, which I'm sure you have.
Have I called it out? I guess I
mean, the Black Network, for example, at EY is a form of calling out.
I mean, there are times where there are subtle racism that I've called out. So, for example, being in a situation where a senior member of staff has mentioned that they don't think I can use a hairdryer on my hair, or asking in a group setting whether I can use a hairdryer on my hair, and raised it as an issue. Like, there's subtle things that I haven't let go, just because I just feel that I don't want somebody else to have to come into that space, and the people who are making those comments haven't been checked. Another example is being asked whether I date white or Black men in the workplace. So again, raising that as a concern so that the person gets checked. So again, they recognize that it's unacceptable, where things I've seen I can make a change, and they need to have a certain skill set, and there's systemic issues. For example, I relaunched the Ernst & Young network and put in processes to make sure that that was sustainable for a period of time. So we instituted a policy where you had rotating chairs, so I would be the chair for 2 years, and then you would have another chair in, so that you would have new fresh blood and talent. Also connecting the dots with external organizations so that best practice could be shared, and we could create a community of corporate employee affinity networks who were able to share best practices. And so those are some of the ways that I guess I've proactively challenged it. I'm sure there's some other ways on a case-by-case basis, but one of the things I'm very conscious of is I'm challenging it every day by trying to live my best life. I mean, that sounds a bit like a cop-out, but most of the things I do intuitively challenge it.
And one of the things that you were starting to touch on there is the power of networks. This is something that I was actually talking to one of the BCA team members about earlier, because we're such a small team at BCA, and being such a unique organization, we have a lot of requests that come into us, because we're like almost like a beacon that attracts people who want to work, who want to do the kind of things that you're doing, and they think maybe BCA is the venue for it, which it can be, but hopefully eventually there'll be plenty more spaces and forums for that. So I was talking to her about how to grow her personal network for support, as much as for like finding opportunities, also for support. And I know that well-being has become more and more important to you throughout your career. So there's like two slightly different things, the power of networks and well-being. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think well-being. Yeah, so from a well-being perspective, that's something that's always been of interest to me, and it's integrated in my life just in terms of the activities I take part in. I had a breakdown at work in terms of I crashed and burned. And so I took some time out, and as a result of that, really started to invest time in understanding health and well-being practices and looking at therapeutic interventions, really studying emotional intelligence. And I set up a blog at that time called Phenomenal Health Style. And there was 7 of us who wrote on that blog and created this community of people who were really interested in various different elements of health and well-being. So I just found, I guess, creative ways to build support networks through creativity and through personal interests. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the questions I saw in the chat was, what are some of the ways that people can network in current times, lockdown, and how do you think people will network in the future? Shared interests. Zoom, we recently produced a event called the Aqua Caribbean Blue Economy Conference, which was a number of Black people who were 8 Black people across the world who pulled together this conference. And we had a number of people from across the world who attended this conference. And that was based on people having a shared interest in the blue economy and the Caribbean and climate change. So I think it's about understanding what you're interested in, and social media platforms and Zoom enable you now to connect with people all over the world. So that's one of the benefits of lockdown during this time.
And I think that so there's an organization called CLAW, and they started up something called Kinship circles recently, which was it was just looking at people of color and how at different levels in their career they might start to create a cohort amongst themselves. And listening to you talk, I'm thinking about those kind of cohorts and how sometimes you have to be patient and then they turn into something like very beautiful. So even thinking about your mentor that you had that you started having that relationship with when you were at school, and then that relationship kind of grew into something else, or your network of friends that you had as a teenager, and now some of those friends are your collaborators in creative projects, and how you can activate those kind of networks. So it's not always about kind of professional networks, it can be kinship networks, and being kind of alive and curious about the possibilities of ways to lift each other up along the way. It's not really a question, it's just a reflection on what you've been saying, but feel free to reflect back on me.
No, I completely agree. I mean, some of the most powerful relationships are people who I've grown up with or connected with during my youth. And I was working outside the UK for 5 years and then came back to the UK and just bumped into some of the people that I grew up with, and they're now award-winning authors, or they are in the theatre or have children. For example, Yasmin was the daughter of somebody I worked on an event called Beauty Within Me, which was a health and wellbeing event targeted at the Black community. So it really is about these kindred groups, as you described. That's a great way to connect.
And being patient as well. I feel like running BCA is making me really patient. It's quite interesting. What else have I got on my list that I haven't talked to you about yet?
I see a question from Alexander. I don't want to ignore his question.
There's a question from Lauren and a question from Alexander that we haven't answered. But I do want you to also speak a little bit about entrepreneurship and how that relates to, like, even if you're not a freelancer, how can you be entrepreneurial through your career? And then we can talk about Lauren and Alexander's questions. Sorry, guys. I've got the microphone.
No, sorry. I think so there's 2 things, I guess. For me, I feel like going in organizations, I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit. And so I've become an intrapreneur when I've been in those organizations. And it's always been about connecting dots. So the combination of relationships, having a desire to learn, and then kind of finding the purpose in stuff, means that you can find the opportunities. And essentially what being an entrepreneur is being able to find opportunities and then translate them into cash, essentially, or opportunities to generate income, or change the world, or whatever your driver is. And so I think, again, there's skills, and you can learn those skills anywhere, and you can learn those skills on the job. When I was still working, I formed GAFA in 2008 because I wanted to understand what it means to form a limited company and what it means to run my own accounts. And so those were things I was learning in terms of how do I apply some of the things I'm learning in a professional context to my own business. And so there were lots of mistakes I was able to make because I wasn't relying on that business to pay me. So now, having that company since 2008, I've got, over 10 years worth of experience of what it means to run a company, good and bad. So I really think focus on the skills, not always the title. Like, everybody wants to, have fancy titles, but actually they don't want to do the work and get the skills
to get there, right?
Get there.
So that's that like patience thing again, in a way. All right, let's talk about Alexander's question. The organizations that Zena worked for or at, did she come across other Black people like herself? And if so, were you able to network with them or not?
Yes and no. So there were other people there that had shared interests, and some that came from the same background, some came from different backgrounds, and there was an affinity because there was only a few of us in the room. And then on the counter, sometimes that made relationships were difficult because some people enjoy being the only one in the room. But what I was fortunate to be able to do in a lot of the organizations was to create a pathway for other people to come in. So wherever I've been, you'll usually see more Black people there after I've left, not less.
That's a legacy in of itself. That's fantastic. So before we go to Lauren's, something about that question and your answer made me remember something else that you and I have talked about. And I wrote it down when you said it. Having values is not for everyone. Do you want to explain?
Yeah. Exactly that, in terms of you come into situations where you think certain things should be a given, and they're not, particularly in terms of how you treat people. I was listening to the panel earlier, and someone was talking about racism and the fact that it's not political, it's about humanity. It's a human right for you to treat people in a certain way, and so I think you can't assume when you come into spaces that everybody is going to operate from the same sort of hymn book, or from the same value sheet. And so you have to be very clear in terms of when it's time for you to leave or move on, and how many of your values compromise, because at some point we all have to make some type of compromises. But you've got to decide when it's too painful to do that, and then make that move on.
I completely agree, and that's one reason why I wanted to bring that up, because I think it's very important for everyone to feel comfortable with leaving. And I think, having values is not for everyone. That's fine, but for people whose career journey is values led, you have to be also comfortable with leaving, and you have to be able to know like how much flex you have internally in yourself between your values, your personal values, and the values that your career might be, that your career might have. Okay, which kind of goes into Lauren's question a little bit, because Lauren asked, what is the biggest lesson you've learned as you've navigated your career and the creative industry generally? I know we're running a little bit over time, but I think this is an important question. So what is the biggest lesson you've learned as you've navigated your career and the creative industry generally?
Biggest lesson I've learned is that relationships trump everything. It's not fair. It's not necessarily right. It should be talent, but relationships trump everything, really. And then people see your talent once you've got the relationships. Money also, we shouldn't be scared of. That's the biggest thing I've learned in terms of my biggest breakthroughs have been when I've been able to generate enough cash to make a change and be the most important person in the room because I'm the person with the checkbook. and that's real. It's not great, but it's real. And I think particularly as Black people, we sometimes shy away from money, but the reality is we're living in a capitalist society, and we're living in a society which is structured around racism and white supremacy. And the only way that you can break through a lot of the times is by being able to have the capital to make a difference, or to have a decision, or make a decision which isn't reliant on money. So I think those are the things I learned. So if I understood the power of money earlier, I would have learned about financial literacy at a much earlier stage in life. And there's organizations like Davinia Tomlinson, who runs Raincheck, who has set up an organization to educate women, but also men, on financial literacy. And for me, arts and money go hand in hand. They shouldn't, but they do, in terms of access.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it, actually. You've given us so many gems and so much wisdom and so much advice. I would like everyone who is, actually just everyone, to have a look not only at Zena's personal website. You can Google her name and that will take you to her personal website, but also her LinkedIn, because these are case studies in two very different ways to present your career and two very different ways to present your CV. And actually, I think that's very useful when you're thinking about job hunting or your next career move, to look at different ways of presenting yourself. So that's your homework, everybody. But for now, thank you so much, Zena, and thank you very much to Jasmine and Karis, the BCA
Yes, thank you,
who put Pathways together. It's Karis's baby, and Jasmine is the admin wizard who has helped us make everything work. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for your questions, and thank you again. Giving thanks to the wonderful Zena Tuitt.
Thank you, Arike.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, please head to the expo next.